Good morning, everybody. I have made sure that I have all of my equipment hooked up. So, the microphone's hooked up. This is the first pass at everything. I'm not redoing a whole bunch of shit this week. Anyway, so we wrapped up our short stint talking about 48 Laws of Power, but I kind of wanted to, I guess, have one more discussion that isn't directly tied to one particular law, but is, I guess, an underpinning of the entire conversation when it comes to addressing power dynamics and how to fix cultural issues in EMS. And ultimately this centers around the idea that your behavior is based on who you are deep down, who you are at your core. And most people, who they are at their core doesn't change. Even when you go through phases of self-improvement, you have to recondition yourself out of bad habits, whatnot. Ultimately, who you are deep down remains pretty constant. We've talked about how both money and power independently are not things that change anybody, but rather they accentuate who those people are. They reveal who those people are. So when you put people in positions where they have a lot of money or a lot of power, you get a very powerful insight into who they are, into what their beliefs are, both of themselves and how they should treat other people, and just their outlook on the world around them. And yes, technically, you can make the argument that when people are under stress, that reveals who they are. To a degree, yes. I think that when people are under stress, it brings out a survival instinct that is inherently selfish, because we inherently want to self-preserve. We want to save our own skin. Everybody has this instinct. It's part of our biological programming. You can't not have it. So yes, in a way, it shows the strength of your character to see, okay, well, to what lengths will you go to self-preserve? The actions that people will take to preserve themselves are ultimately the same. What varies is what's the threshold at which you engage in those actions. What's the threshold at which you will go all in and say, fuck it, damn the consequences, I'm gonna make it out of this. Now that sounds very hyperbolic, because obviously we're not living in caves or running around with spears trying to survive day to day. But because of that era of our evolution, and I'm not getting into that discussion, just humans have evolved over time as humans. That became part of our neurological programming. It became part of how our brains function at a baseline. So when you put people in situations where, okay, no, maybe their life isn't in jeopardy per se, but their livelihood is, which ties into their need for security and protection. And this gets into a discussion of hierarchy of needs, which is beyond the scope of this episode. But putting people in stressful situations, it to a degree shows who they are, but it's when you give them freedom and ability to do things that you really see who they are. You really see, are they a generous person? Are they a good, kind person? Or are they a manipulative, dare I say, narcissistic person? And I know that term is highly overused in pop sci, but anyway, when you give people power, when you give them money, you discover a lot about who they are as individuals and what they're capable of. So when we're discussing this series on the 48 Laws of Power, looking at these tools, these principles of power, it's very easy to look at them and be like, this is kind of scary. And yes, it is scary to a degree, but it's only scary if it's the bad people who are implementing these tools for nefarious ends. But when you have good people who down at their very core are good people, and you arm them with these principles of power and power dynamics, not only are they able to leverage good, but they're also able to more effectively deal with the corruption and the people who are inherently bad. And no, I'm not a Christian. I would say, I'm going to go with the cliched answer of I'm a spiritual person. That's, again, beyond the scope of this particular episode. But I do believe that there's a degree of good and evil in this world. I think there's a lot more neutrality than people are willing to admit. But deep down, I do believe that there are extreme ends on the spectrum of good versus evil. I do believe that. I can't look around at the world and not believe that. But I think that we like to classify everything as hardcore objective good versus evil when there's really it's not even an ends justifies the means kind of principle, because I don't inherently agree with that. But we have to look at the big picture of life and differentiate between, is someone doing something that I disagree with, or are they doing something that is objectively wrong? Because those are two very different things. Your internal compass may dictate that you behave a certain way, think a certain way, talk a certain way, but that doesn't mean that that translates out to everybody else. And obviously there's generalities to that. There's general common sense things that are objectively wrong. But I think that we are too quick to compartmentalize and classify and categorize very, very quickly. And I think that it creates a lot of conflicts that don't need to be there. Now, this is something that maybe sounds very academic, but I think a lot of parents will understand the struggle, because there are a lot of times as a parent where you have to make a decision. You have to draw lines that aren't necessarily based on morality. However, you need some structure. So you do have to rule by fiat in certain circumstances. Personally, I try to minimize that. I try to allow my children leeway on things. However, there's a lot of things where I can't do that. It's this constant back and forth between, okay, what do I need to draw the line on? What do I need to make a morality level issue versus, hey, you know what? I really just don't like this. This is just not effective for us as a family. We're just not going to do this. That's a tough call to make. But when we're evaluating other people, we need to realize that we are not other people's parents. People are going to do things that you don't understand and don't agree with. The dog is walking dangerously close to some of the wires, so I'm just making sure he's not going to be a shithead. Anyway, Michelle and I have had this conversation a lot, even in the last 24 hours. And, we'll be discussing certain people's behaviors. And she's like, I don't understand. Why are people like this? Why do people do this? I'm like, people are going to do a lot of things that don't make sense to us. That doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. Or even if it is wrong, we don't understand what's going on in their head. And most people's behavior is based on years of conditioning and programming. That doesn't remove the consequences of their actions. It does not justify the ethics or morality of their decisions and their behavior. But it is something we need to take into consideration and realize that just because we don't understand why someone's doing something doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense for them who they are. Or even if it doesn't make sense for who they are, there's a lot of people who have a lot of very unhealthy, dangerous coping mechanisms. And this is not limited to gender or ethnicity at all. Humans have a lot of common ground when it comes to how we respond to traumas and how those trauma coping mechanisms translate out to the rest of our lives and affect things downstream that we don't immediately realize. There could be a couple degrees of separation, and it takes practiced eyes to sit down and figure that out. So I'm very leery of ever asking the question of, well, why would someone do something like this? Because there's infinite number of reasons why they could or would that are either objectively morally right or wrong, or just a question of ethics where they made one particular decision that's slightly different than I would have made. That's just the way life is. We can't control that. I think that us learning to be introspective and to understand, have a why for why we do things, but also not pigeonhole people. Because when we start to assume what someone would or wouldn't do, or why they would or wouldn't do something, you develop a blind spot. And that's not smart. That doesn't mean that you walk around paranoid of everybody. It just means that you walk around with a basic awareness that things can change. The present is fragile. People are going to behave however they are going to behave, how they have conditioned themselves to behave. Because ultimately, we are the ones conditioning our own minds. We are the ones who are setting the programming. Yes, we are responding to external stimuli from other people, and those stimuli can be traumatic, it can be frustrating, it can be life altering, earth shattering for us. But it's still ultimately on us how we respond to that, and the story that we tell ourselves, the conditioning that we do in our own minds, is our responsibility. That is why when you go to therapy, a therapist shouldn't. Yeah, they're going to give you homework and things to do, but it's to the end goal of getting you to do the work of reconditioning. Sorry about that. The dog was having a situation with the cats. But when you're going through therapy, the point is for you to do the work, for you to do the examination, and you to start implementing a new conditioning process that not only addresses past trauma, but affects how you process trauma moving forward. All of our coping mechanisms are ultimately our responsibility, because you can have two people who experience the same traumatic event or events, series of events, and they have completely different outcomes in life. One uses that trauma as an excuse, the other uses that trauma as motivation. That's a decision that each of those people made who went through identical events. That was their decision. So when we're discussing why do people do things this way or that way or whatever, whether or not we agree with it, 9 times out of 10, it is rooted in things and in past experiences and conditioning that we can't see. We don't have the ability to look into their soul to see that. So instead of getting hung up on asking the question, well, why does so and so, I don't understand why people do this, I don't understand why people do that, you never will. Even people that you are close with, most of the time, you will never understand why exactly they do certain things the way they do. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of our existence. And learning to give people the benefit of the doubt where we can. Obviously, there are some things that are objectively right and wrong and need to be handled that appropriately, need to be handled as such. There does need to be a certain level of compassion that we have on other people, even the people that are our enemies, even the people that are actively working against us in whatever sphere of life you're talking about. But even they deserve a certain level of compassion because you don't know. I remember as a kid watching the old Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And my parents actually didn't like the movie that much. They still let us watch it, but they really objected to how Captain Nemo was portrayed because they basically said, well, they're making it look like, he was justified in doing these horrible things and killing all these people because of his past. No, you past trauma, losing a loved one or whatever, does not authorize you to go on killing sprees. But nevertheless, we can't ignore that those experiences played a role in how that character developed. So obviously that's a very, lighthearted, fictitious example. But even when people do horrible, atrocious things that do need to be handled, they do have to have consequences, and they need to be sometimes addressed harshly. We should still have a certain level of compassion for those people, and should still give the benefit of the doubt where we can, stick with what we know, because sometimes our feelings can lead us astray on this. Our feelings will lead us to think that, oh, well, they did this because of this and this and this and this and this, and because of this and because of this. And it's, it usually turns inward and is made about us. And 9 times out of 10, it has nothing to do with us. Other people's behavior has nothing to do with us. They were behaving in accordance with their operating principles. So I have found it helpful to, instead of asking the question, well, why did people do this? Why did so and so do this? I look at, does it affect me? Number one. Number two, is there some deeper issue going on with that person? Now, that doesn't mean that I go and try to fix it. It just means I, have to acknowledge that, okay, maybe there's something else going on here. At the end of the day, you still have to take action. You still have to deal with it. There's a lot of people who actively bring down our profession from inside. And I stand as an enemy to those people. That doesn't mean I hate them. That doesn't mean that I wish ill on them. It simply means I oppose you. I want to work against what you are doing. I make that decision based on principle, not because of some, inflated sense of ego or being on some kind of like white knight mission or something like that. No, I stand opposed to what you do and what you stand for. That doesn't mean I hate that person. Doesn't mean I wouldn't be willing to be friends with that person under the right circumstances. This means right here, right now, they're behaving a certain way. I'm going to react a certain way. I can only hope that in those situations, these people will turn inward and reevaluate themselves. But if they don't, guess what? I still got shit to do. We all do. So just remember, when we're talking about power and money and influence, look for tells of who people are deep down, not just the surface level behaviors. So what's driving them deep down? You'll gain kind of an interesting perspective on the rest of the world. So, if you learned something good, share it with your friends. If you were offended, good. Tell your friends. Maybe they can laugh at you too. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.